Hello, fifth graders, and welcome back to Language Arts. Before we get into today's lesson, I want to talk a little bit about your homework and make sure that we're understanding. So, a lot of you got feedback from me reminding you that when you're doing those short answer questions, we need to make sure that we're using as many words from the question in the answer as possible. And again, yes, as many words as possible, even those parts that say on page 9 or the parts that start at the beginning, according to his mother, right? Those are things that need to be in your short answer question. So for the first couple of days, I'm kind of just giving a reminder and saying, hey, heads up, in the future, I'm going to ask you to redo it. But pretty soon here, if we're having a tough time, I'm going to ask you to like retype your answers in the comments or redo that homework assignment. So keep that in mind as we're working, that you're noting that change. So let's talk quickly about these answers. So, according to Gilgamesh, according to his mother, what does Gilgamesh's dream mean? You should have been following along, and I really pointed it out. It was on page 5, but she tells him that according to his mother, Gilgamesh's dream means that the gods will send him a friend. Okay. And then I asked, what is this dream? What literary device is this dream an example of? You should have seen the key, but we would say this dream is an example of the literary device of foreshadowing. So we're getting this hint from the author through Gilgamesh's mother and through this dream that a friend is coming. Okay. Provide one quote from pages 8 through 9 that shows how the usher feels about Gilgamesh. In terms of the quote, you could have picked a wide variety of quotes, but setting up your answer, one quote from pages 8 through 9 that shows how the usher feels about Gilgamesh is, so you want to make sure you're setting up that answer. So many great examples that people were showing. The usher tells us that Gilgamesh has worn his people down like a river flowing through a gorge, like a waterfall splashing onto rocks. That would be a great explanation. He makes perpetual war, another good quote. He spends our sons like so many arrows in his quiver, another great quote. We call on the gods to spare us, but on runs Gilgamesh with us for the soles of his sandals. These are all excellent quotes, and I saw a lot of you selecting great quotes with how the usher is describing Gilgamesh. So number 4, these complaints could be evidence that Gilgamesh is full of what? We should have said hubris. Remember, this is this excessive pride. We see that it describes that Gilgamesh is building higher in a hope to touch the sky, right? So this kind of shows us that he's overestimating or thinking more highly of himself than others. And I say could be evidence because hopefully you remember that the second half of hubris, that other part of hubris, is that it has to lead to a downfall. And at this point in the story, we don't really know whether or not Gilgamesh will experience a downfall. So it could be hubris. We don't know yet. Page 9. Provide one quote from page 9 of how the narrator describes Gilgamesh. So again, setting up your answer, one quote from page 9 of how the narrator describes Gilgamesh is so many wonderful quotes. We're told that he is outrageously handsome. I love this quote, right? He's not just like regular person handsome, not like, oh, he's kind of a good looking guy. The narrator tells us that he is outrageously handsome, like more handsome than like anybody, right? So this description, that would have been a great quote, that he's outrageously handsome. We're also told he's got huge dark eyes, springy short black hair. Those would have been great quotes. That he has runner's legs would be great. That his skin gleamed with olive almond oil, or that he smelt of the bathhouse and nutmeg, or that his belt was gold wire, his collar of lapis lazuli. So we see from this description of Gilgamesh, right, that he has a lot going for him, right? He's attractive, he's athletic, he has a lot of expensive, luxurious things. So this is supposed to really paint a picture, right? This very young, muscular, athletic, strong, attractive man, right? And kind of gleaming skin. And again, the narrator is really showing us that he is like beyond, right? He's so incredibly handsome. So any of those quotes would have been great quotes. So we infer. Remember when I told you about inferring, this means that you are the author is not telling us this piece of information. We kind of have to draw a conclusion, a reasonable conclusion based on what we know from the text. And actually these two examples here, 1 and 2, are how we should have a hint to this inference here. So who Gilgamesh is asking Hunter about at the end of the chapter, when Gilgamesh is saying, "Did you see anyone like me?" He's asking about this friend that he's been told will be coming. Okay? And finally, for number 7, we have this vocabulary word despot, which remember is sort of an overbearing, angry, controlling, excessively powerful ruler. Okay? So we wouldn't say that a despot is kind or generous. We wouldn't say that a despot is afraid. So we should have picked this third option. The despot shouted orders to his subjects and demanded that they work harder. Quickly, 5th graders, I'm going to just show your objective. For today, we're working on describing Enkidu. So if we're drawing conclusions, what this means is that we're going to meet a character named Enkidu. Okay? As we are getting ready for today, these are the things you will need. Much like yesterday. You will need, for certain, your copy of Gilgamesh. Okay? You also may want paper or your notebook and a pencil. And again, that's to get us set up for writing our answers as we go. So you could, again, I've kind of mentioned that it's possible that you maybe are choosing to work side by side. So as you see a question, you're answering it on the form, or you maybe are writing those answers down as you go. So either one of those work. So we're going to take a look again at today's form quickly, similar instructions. So number 1, provide one quote from pages 12 to 13 that shows how the narrator describes Enkidu. This is directly related to our objective. And again, when you set up that answer, one quote from pages 12 through 13 that shows how the narrator describes Enkidu is. Question 2 asks us, why do the animals flee from Enkidu? 3, why does Enkidu flare into a rage? Which is another way that, these are the exact words that the author uses, flare into a rage, but this means that he's getting very angry. 4 asks, what was Gilgamesh contemplating? This again, contemplating is a word that the author is using, but to contemplate something is to think about. So what is Gilgamesh thinking about? So again, setting up your answer, Gilgamesh was contemplating blank. Question 5, what foreshadowing was fulfilled at the end of the chapter? So the foreshadowing that was fulfilled at the end of the chapter is, and remember, if it's fulfilled, it means it's come true. What foreshadowing has come true? And then we have another vocabulary sentence. So far, I haven't asked you to write your own, but which of the following correctly uses the word ebbed? He collapsed to the ground in exhaustion as his strength ebbed, or the joy in the room ebbed as he was surrounded by her smiling, loving family, as she was surrounded. So 5th graders, remember, we're going to get into our reading together. Writing answers as you go, clicking answers as you go, that's fine. Remember that this video is yours to pause as needed. Remember also that your job while we are going through this together is to be reading along with me. Your eyes should be, excuse me, on the page. When I'm reading, you're following along. That is what is helping you to become a better reader, not just listening, but listening and following. We're on page 12, starting Tamed by a Kiss. Again, if you need to get anything ready, so then pause and do that, but then come on back because we're jumping right in. So chapter 2, Tamed by a Kiss. Enkidu was formed out of clay. Aruru, goddess of beginnings, dipped dawn fingers into the sea and pinched off a knob of earth, smoothing it into the shape of a man. And that was Enkidu. So as I read now, we're jumping right into question 1, so we should be paying attention as I'm reading these next paragraphs. But the clay she used was full of tree bark, leaf mold, broken snail shells, and seed husks, so that the man she made was shaggy and rough, with a pelt of matted hair and a bark brown face. When he opened his nut brown eyes, he found himself among animals. The wild ass would stand still while he drank her milk. The birds sing in answer to his whistle. The wild dogs fawn sooner than bite him. But Enkidu did not know if he was ass or dog or bird. Whenever he found traps or nets or pits left by hunters, Enkidu spoiled them, meaning he ruined them or destroyed them. This should connect back in the first chapter where Hunter kept finding his traps destroyed. So Enkidu spoiled them because he thought of the animals as his family. But the day he saw Hunter crouching by the water hole, he felt more puzzlement than hostility. So we're seeing now Enkidu's side of the story. Remember where he was kind of staring intently at Hunter, and Hunter is terrified because this very hairy man who's kind of walking on all fours is staring at him. But Hunter, it tells us, but Enkidu, when he sees Hunter, who is a human, it says that he has more puzzlement, which is confusion. So when he saw him, he was more confused or maybe curious than he was hostile, meaning angry or violent. So Enkidu actually doesn't feel violence towards him. He feels sort of this confusion or interest, maybe. Here was a beast like him, a small, scrawny version of the reflection Enkidu saw when he lay down to drink from the pool. Still, Enkidu's brain was made from clay, and after the trapper ran away and his smell faded from the water hole, Enkidu forgot him. Then, suddenly, one day there came an altogether different smell, as sweet as wild honey. It made the long hairs stir on Enkidu's skin. He walked fast, then faster, breaking into a loping run. The smell was like hunger and thirst, hot and cold, all rolled together into a craving. The woman was sitting cross-legged on a blanket, her eyes trailing butterflies through the sunlit trees. At the sight of Enkidu, she raised one arm, waved one hand. She was totally, goldenly, shell-smoothly naked. For hour after hour, there she sat, fanning herself with a large leaf or plaiting her long black hair. Plaiting is like braiding, so she's braiding her hair. Closer and closer he sidled, bristling with uneasiness, brim full of strange new appetites. The woman reached out a hand, curling a single finger, beckoning. At last, Enkidu put down his head and charged. So remember, this was the recommendation. Hunter went to Gilgamesh and said, "This creature is destroying my traps. What do I do?" And Gilgamesh's advice was, bring a woman to tame him. And so this woman now has been brought. And Enkidu is smelling her, and she's sweet, and she's braiding her hair, and he looks, and he's confused. So what does he do? He puts his head down and charges straight at her. Arms and legs outstretched, he hurled himself like a boulder onto an egg. But she did not break. And she would not fight. Instead, she curled her arms around his neck and pressed her mouth against his. "Hello," she said. His arms and legs turned to water. His strength ebbed. There's our vocabulary word our vocabulary sentence. His strength ebbed away like water on sand. All his instincts had been right. Here was a snare, an ambush, a trap, a pit into which he had fallen. And yet, Enkidu did not care. It was a sweet trap, a soft pit, a silken snare. "I am Hattie. The trapper brought me all the way from Uruk. Have you ever seen Uruk, wild man? It is one of the 7 cities of the plain. Once upon a time, 7 wise men founded 7 cities and taught the people how to pray, how to worship, how to make verses and paint and sing and write. Uruk is called the city of great streets. In the mornings, a drum summons the men to work. You should see the robes the great men wear. In Uruk, the vines grow like hair over the roofs of the houses, and the flower sellers move about, bright as hummingbirds. The women play with their little children under the shady trees, and there is always a sound of water from the wells. The river winds by, and washed cloths blow about in the trees on the riverside. As she talked, she plucked the burrs from his woolly skin and teased the matted knots out of his waist-length hair. Every time he shaped his mouth into a howl or a snarl, she pressed her lips to his. This is kind of how our chapter title comes from, Tamed by a Kiss. Come with me to the camp of the shepherds and meet more men like yourself. Eat roast meat, white bread. Life is good among friends. The warmth of the campfire at night, the smell of baking in the mornings. Her voice was musical, and her words fell like rain on his brain of clay. She gave him wine too, pouring it into his mouth along with kisses. After 7 days, the wind brought him the scent of the hills. Throwing her aside, he leapt to his feet and ran back into the hills, his clay brain slippery with wine, his head a rattle with words. He ran to find the wild ass for a drink of her milk, but the asses scattered. The gazelle sprang away from him in huge arcing bounds. The wild dogs growled, and the birds rose into the sky like ash from fire. He was no longer one of their kind. He had on him the smell of perfume and sweet oil and wine. Confused, alone, he roamed about, shouting some of the strange words he had heard on the woman's lips. Jugglers! Temple top! Local banda! Berry juice! Gilgamesh! And his roaring took him back to the drinking place. Still Hattie sat on her blanket, legs crossed, hands on her ankles. She beckoned to him, and this time he understood when she said, Come, Enkidu, and let me show you the world of men. So Enkidu is kind of like halfway between, right? He grew up living with wild animals and spending time with them, and then now Hattie has made him act more like a human and smell more like a human. And he's kind of figuring it out, right? We see that he's shouting words and he doesn't necessarily know what those words mean, but he's expressing his frustration and his anger using words that he's heard of her. But now he's no longer quite wild. And we see this answer to number 2 in that paragraph of describing why the animals no longer are spending time around Enkidu. So remember, this little symbol here is a clue that we're switching to a little bit of a later time or maybe another place. Hunter was delighted at what Hattie had achieved. He could see at once that Enkidu was no longer a beast to fear. There would be no more broken traps or torn nets. Hunter and the shepherds laughed to see how the ignorant brute called Enkidu could not even drink from a cup, did not know what to do with a loaf of bread or a dish of lentils. But Hattie did not laugh. She sat beside Enkidu, her torrent of black hair breaking over his bent knee, showing him how to use a knife, how to refill a cup. The shepherds stopped laughing when they saw him cram down 7 loaves and drain the last of their wine. Your food is good, said Enkidu, finishing another loaf of bread. What must I do to sit at your fireside another day? Hunter gasped. Hattie had taught the wild man to speak. These shepherds take turns at night to keep watch, guarding the sheep from lions and wolves. No longer, declared Enkidu. I shall keep watch all night, and by day I shall kill lions. I sleep little. The shepherds looked at one another in delight. The protector of animals had become the protector of flocks. Enkidu, having lost one family in the uplands, so he lost his family of wild animals, we're being told, had found another family on the plains. He was happy in a restless, waiting sort of way. So the narrator tells us that Enkidu is kind of finding some happiness and joy, but there's this restlessness, this waiting, this anticipation. So maybe if your mind is kind of thinking about what we read in chapter 1, that you maybe are starting to piece some things together, that Enkidu seems to be restless and waiting, and there's another character who seems to be restless and waiting, and perhaps we're being hinted, maybe foreshadowed, that these two are going to cross paths. One evening at the fireside, Hattie said, I should go back to Uruk. I am a dancing girl. My place is in the city of streets. Poor you, said the shepherds with genuine sympathy. Ah, now, Gilgamesh may be a trial to his people, argued Hunter, but it was his genius that tamed Enkidu. Who is this Gilgamesh? Said Enkidu, bridling a little. A tyrant and a marvel, so they say. A blessing and a curse, I heard. A dream and a nightmare. So they're all kind of describing that Gilgamesh is great, right? And our description of Gilgamesh from chapter 1 shows that he is great and excellent and has all of these wonderful gifts of his, but also that as a ruler, he is not very kind, not very virtuous. So Enkidu learned of King Gilgamesh of Uruk, who had worn down his people like water falling on a rock, who had spent them in wars like so many arrows, who exhausted them with his boundless energy. The wild man flared into a rage. It's a hint, fifth graders, that often when I seem to slow down and read very deliberately, I'm hinting to you that maybe there's an answer to be found. The wild man flared into a rage at what they told him. Is that any way for a father of his people to behave? I shall go to Uruk and challenge this Gilgamesh. He leapt to his feet. This demon must not be allowed to trample the hearts of his own people. Soft palmed, sponge bellied city slugger, I shall pound him into clay. So again, remember that little swirly figure is a hint that we're switching settings somehow. King Gilgamesh was contemplating marriage. Every day he shut himself up in the temple of Ishtar, goddess of love, and the people outside could hear the slap of his sandals on the pavement. The city swarmed with panic. Rumor had it that the king would marry the terrible Ishtar herself. So interestingly, right, we learned that that Ishtar is the goddess of love, but also she's described as terrible. So there's a little bit of a tension there. Then a new stir swirled through the marketplace. The crowds parted for a new face, a man almost as alarming as Gilgamesh in his size and the spread of his shoulders. So Enkidu seems as big, as strong as Gilgamesh. Hattie, the pretty little dancing girl, was with him. The crowd murmured and gasped. He is the size of Gilgamesh. Shorter. Yes, but thicker set. A wild man bred up with the lions. Gilgamesh came out of the temple and turned toward his mother's house. His mind was made up. He would woo and marry the goddess of love. She was the only fitting bride. Enkidu stepped out into his path. Gilgamesh, deep in thoughts of marriage, moved to go round him. Enkidu stuck out a foot and tripped him up. Gilgamesh grabbed Enkidu's arm as he fell and pulled him down too. He was instantly enraged. They wrestled in the doorways of the houses, their bulk smashing the doorposts and bringing down the lintels. They grappled each other head to head, chest to chest, barging through the walls of buildings. First, Gilgamesh was on his back, his face full of the wild man's hair, his nose bleeding. Then the king was on top of Enkidu, their hands locked together. Scattering chickens, demolishing goat pens, overturning pails, the two men wrestled for fully an hour. Then Gilgamesh caught Enkidu off balance and with a twist of the body hurled him to the ground. Enkidu lay winded. Gilgamesh, hands clasped on knees, snorted out a triumphant laugh as he struggled to catch his breath. Then Enkidu, too, laughed. Lying on his back, he saw the fearful stars blinking down between the high buildings and laughed out loud. There is not another man in the world like you, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh sat down with his back against a wall. It was an unfamiliar feeling to be tired out. The two men looked at one another. Then Enkidu flexed his arms, and Gilgamesh flexed his, and they fell onto each other again. But this time it was an embrace. They've hugged each other now. They hugged each other with the passion of new friends who know that they will stick together through thick and thin, come what may, do or die. So at this point, fifth graders, they wrestled and fought, and then they realized that their pretty similar, right? These two people who had never quite met anyone like each other have now found in each other a friendship. So, question 5, fifth graders, is asking us what foreshadowing was fulfilled at the end of the chapter. So, thinking about what chapter 1 tells us to anticipate, thinking about this sort of restless energy that's been coming from certain characters of our text, what was fulfilled, what foreshadowing seems to have come true by the end of the chapter. So, fifth graders, again, go ahead and answer your questions. Yes, you can use your book. You can look back in your text if you need to. You can reread. You can play this video again. But go ahead and answer those questions. And remember, complete sentences using as many words from the question as possible when you're doing those short answers. And remember to work carefully. Again, I'm not necessarily going to require perfection from you, but I am going to require you to show me that you really are having read through the text and are understanding it. So you want to make sure you are taking time to do the best work that you can. Good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.